47 tanks. Gone. Not disabled, not retreating, not captured. Gone. Smoldering craters in the desert where $1 billion worth of the most sophisticated armor in the Middle East used to sit. 4 hours. That is how long it took. And I am going to be honest with you right now before we go any further, because you deserve honesty more than you deserve a clean narrative. When I first saw the damage assessment numbers this morning, my instinct was not to believe them. Not because I doubted what Iran is capable of. I stopped making that mistake years ago, but because nothing in 40 years of studying armored warfare prepared me for a kill ratio like this in a single engagement against a formation of that quality. Then the satellite imagery came through, then the drone footage, then the ground-level photographs circulating right now despite every effort to suppress them. And I sat with those images for a long time before I started recording this, because what I was looking at was not just the wreckage of tanks. It was the wreckage of a doctrine, an entire way of thinking about land warfare, about deterrence, about what expensive and sophisticated equipment actually buys you on a modern battlefield, reduced to scorched metal in the northern Negev overnight. If you came here expecting coverage that manages this story into something digestible and ultimately comfortable, this is not going to be that. What happened to the IDF's 401st Armored Brigade last night is one of the most consequential single engagements in the history of modern ground warfare. And the implications reach far beyond Israel, far beyond Iran, and far beyond this conflict. They reach into every armored brigade headquarters in NATO, into every defense ministry currently writing checks for next-generation tanks, and into the strategic calculations of every nation that has built its security architecture around the assumption that American backing is unconditional. So stay with me, 2,000 drones, not a handful of strike assets launched at a fixed target, 2,000 coordinated autonomous attack platforms executing a 4-wave strike sequence against a moving armored formation across a 12-kilometer front, in the dark, with a targeting precision that the Western analytical community had assessed was at minimum 2 to 3 years away from operational maturity. Iran did not just attack an Israeli armored brigade last night. Iran conducted a live demonstration in operational conditions against the most combat-experienced armored force in the Middle East, of a capability that nobody in Washington, nobody in Tel Aviv, and frankly nobody in any defense ministry currently procuring next-generation tanks had fully priced into their threat models. The formation that was hit was the 401st Armored Brigade. Not a garrison unit, not a reserve formation. One of the most decorated ground combat units in the Israeli military at full operational readiness, conducting a deliberate tactical movement when the first wave arrived. Movement is supposed to help armored formations. A moving formation is harder to target than a static one. That is doctrine. On this night, movement worked against them. 60-plus tank engines running simultaneously produce a thermal signature that is, if anything, cleaner and easier to process than a static defensive position. The dust trails from tracked vehicles crossing dry terrain are visible on every sensor package those first-wave reconnaissance drones were carrying. The electromagnetic emissions from the formation's command vehicles, the radio traffic, the radar emissions from its own defensive systems, all of it combined to hand Iranian strike coordinators a targeting picture of extraordinary clarity. The 4-wave strike architecture is worth understanding precisely because the sophistication of that architecture is the story beneath the story. The first wave, approximately 400 Shahed 136 platforms, did not attack anything. They acted as a distributed sensor network, building a real-time targeting picture of the formation's exact composition, vehicle spacing, and movement vectors. That data was processed and transmitted to the Strike Coordination Center within minutes, generating individual target assignments for every drone in the waves that followed. That is not improvisation. That is an integrated kill chain that required years of dedicated development. The second wave arrived 18 minutes later. 600 Shahed 238 jet-powered variants, moving at over 350 kilometers per hour, executing direct attack profiles against the Merkava tanks designated as highest priority targets. At that speed, the engagement window for the formation's defensive systems was under 90 seconds per incoming threat. The brigade's organic air defense, primarily man-portable Stinger systems and a single battery of radar-guided guns, achieved somewhere between 80 and 100 intercepts out of 600 simultaneous attack profiles arriving from 4 different directions. 15% intercept rate. The armor was effectively unprotected. The third wave targeted the formation's supporting infrastructure with a logic that reflects genuine understanding of how armored formations sustain themselves, not just the tanks, the fuel trucks, the ammunition carriers, the maintenance vehicles. By destroying that infrastructure, Iran ensured that even tanks that survived the initial strike had a rapidly closing operational window. And the fourth wave conducted a systematic cleanup, targeting everything identified as damaged but not destroyed in the earlier waves, ensuring the 401st Brigade's combat capability was not merely degraded but comprehensively, irreversibly eliminated. Final count: 47 Merkava IV tanks destroyed, 23 additional tanks non-operational, 63 Namer APCs and infantry fighting vehicles destroyed, 31 artillery pieces destroyed or damaged, approximately 340 IDF personnel killed or wounded, the largest single engagement casualty figure for Israeli ground forces in decades. The Merkava IV is one of the finest main battle tanks ever produced. I say that without reservation. The front-mounted engine design, the trophy active protection system, the optimized internal layout for crew survivability, these design choices reflect decades of hard-won combat experience translated into steel and electronics. Against the threats the Merkava IV was designed to defeat, it performs exceptionally well. The problem is that it was not designed to defeat what hit it last night. Trophy is one of the most capable hard-kill active protection systems on any production tank in the world. Against RPG-7s, Cornet anti-tank missiles, and similar direct-fire threats, its combat record is genuinely impressive. What Trophy was not optimized for is a near-vertical terminal dive attack from directly above the turret, arriving at 350 kilometers per hour, delivered simultaneously by dozens of platforms. The radar coverage architecture that makes Trophy so effective against conventional threats arriving on flat trajectories from ground level has known limitations in the upper hemisphere. The roof armor of the Merkava IV, while thicker than most contemporary tanks, is significantly thinner than its frontal armor. This is true of virtually every main battle tank in service because the historical threat environment for armor has been dominated by direct-fire weapons from roughly horizontal angles. What Iran's targeting planners built into the attack doctrine deployed last night was a specific two-drone engagement sequence designed to exploit Trophy's reload cycle. The first drone in each pairing approached from the formation's front or flank, triggering a Trophy engagement and consuming one of the system's ready-to-fire defensive charges. The second drone, arriving from a different vector 4 to 6 seconds later with the Trophy system mid-reload, executed the top attack profile against the now partially unprotected tank. That tactic required specific knowledge of Trophy's operational cycling parameters. And Trophy's characteristics are not a closely held secret. The system has been in service for over 15 years. Its engagement parameters have been observed, analyzed, and published in open-source military literature. Iran's defense engineering community is serious. They did the work. And the implication for every active protection program currently being sold to defense ministries as the definitive answer to the anti-armor threat is direct and urgent. Every next-generation tank program in development today, the German Kf-51 Panther, the American NGCV program, the British Challenger 3 upgrade, incorporates active protection as a central survivability feature. The procurement programs that were sold to defense ministries on the basis of active protection providing near-comprehensive survivability need to be reviewed. The threat model changed last night. The procurement assumptions have not caught up yet. Now, I want to talk about Washington's response because what the United States did, and more importantly, what it did not do, tells you more about the actual state of the American alliance commitment than anything you will read in a press briefing. What Washington did was issue a statement expressing deep concern, reaffirm its commitment to Israel's security, and quietly reposition 2 destroyer-class vessels further from the Lebanese coastline. What Washington did not do is the part that matters. No American air assets were ordered to strike the Iranian drone launch facilities that executed this operation. No mutual defense frameworks that decades of alliance rhetoric implied would be automatically triggered were invoked. The explanation that American restraint reflects diplomatic sophistication is a cover story for a simpler reality. The United States did not intervene directly because the cost-benefit calculation of direct intervention does not favor it. Direct strikes against Iranian facilities would require penetrating Iranian airspace against significantly enhanced air defenses. Iranian retaliation against American bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE would produce American casualties whose political consequences would overwhelm whatever military objective was being pursued. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, even temporarily, would produce economic shocks that no administration wants to manage. So Washington calculated correctly from a self-interest standpoint that the cost of direct intervention exceeds the benefit. This is not a criticism of American decision-making as such. It is a description of how great powers actually behave when alliance commitments collide with genuine self-interest. The problem is the gap between how American alliance commitments have been described as unconditional, automatic, comprehensive, and how they actually function when honoring them carries real cost. Israel has structured its entire national security architecture around the assumption that American backing is unconditional. The events of last night and Washington's response have demonstrated with operational finality that this assumption is incorrect. Let me tell you something about the people who built the weapons that destroyed those Merkava tanks, because this dimension receives less attention than it deserves, and it is in many ways the most important dimension of all. The engineers who designed the Shahed 238, who developed the drone swarm coordination architecture, who worked out the trophy exploitation tactic and built it into the targeting software, did this under conditions that would have broken most institutional research programs in the world. They worked without access to international scientific collaboration networks because sanctions restricted them. They worked without the ability to procure specialized components because export controls blocked their supply chains. They worked knowing that their facilities were targets, that their colleagues had been assassinated for exactly this kind of work, and they produced a weapon system that just destroyed 47 of the most sophisticated main battle tanks in the Middle East in a single night. The contrast with how Israeli military capability is built is instructive. The F-35s in Israeli service were designed in America, manufactured in America, and are maintained through American supply chains that Israel does not control. The Tamir interceptors that Iron Dome fires were co-developed with American funding. The specialized munitions Israeli air power relies on for its most demanding strike missions are procured from American suppliers. When those supply chains are stressed, Israeli military capability degrades in ways that have no domestic remedy. This manifested in concrete operational terms last night. The 401st Brigade had been operating under a shortage of specific anti-drone munitions, the trophy systems ready-to-fire charges, and the Stinger missiles organic to its air defense element because resupply from American sources had been delayed by production allocation constraints. The formation went into the field with less than a full defensive loadout, not because of any failure of Israeli logistics management, because the weapons it needed to defend itself are made in America, and America's production schedule did not accommodate the resupply timeline. Every drone in that 2,000 platform swarm is a physical embodiment of a decision made under duress to choose the harder road of self-reliance over the easier road of dependency. That is Iran's most durable strategic asset. It cannot be sanctioned, it cannot be targeted, and it does not depreciate. The consequences extend far beyond the immediate military balance, and several of the most significant are not yet receiving the attention they deserve. Approximately 30 nations currently operate main battle tanks as the primary instrument of their ground combat doctrine. Every single one of those nations is right now conducting an urgent internal review of whether the platform they have invested billions in remains viable against the threat that just destroyed the 401st Brigade. Poland's Abrams purchase, Germany's Leopard 2 upgrade program, Australia's Abrams replacement evaluation, all of these are now being assessed against a threat model that changed fundamentally last night. Russia is watching with a quality of strategic attention its public statements will not fully reflect. The T-14 Armada incorporates the Afghanit Active Protection System, which faces the same fundamental coverage geometry limitations that Trophy demonstrated last night. China's interest is both military and strategic. Chinese armored doctrine is heavily invested in the Type 99A and Type 15 platforms, modern tanks that share the same fundamental drone vulnerability as every other contemporary armored system. The demonstration that Iranian drone swarms can defeat Israeli-American armored capability in operational conditions strengthens the case for Chinese investment in comparable drone warfare capability and validates the broader Chinese strategic interest in supporting Iranian defense development. For the broader developing world, the engagement in the northern Negev provides a reference point that will reshape defense procurement philosophy for a generation. A relatively modest investment in drone swarm capability defeated a $1 billion armored force that a smaller nation could never hope to match on conventional terms. Nations that have been told by Western arms suppliers that sophisticated ground force capability requires sophisticated and expensive platforms are looking at the northern Negev imagery right now and drawing their own conclusions. The political consequences within Israel are potentially existential for the current government. The IDF has never lost an armored engagement at this scale. A government that presided over the loss of 47 Merkava tanks in a single night faces a domestic political reckoning for which there is no comfortable narrative management solution. The imagery exists. The casualty notifications are already reaching families across Israel. The pressure for either decisive military retaliation or fundamental strategic reassessment will be overwhelming, and neither option is without severe risks. Retaliation at a scale sufficient to demonstrate consequences requires penetrating Iranian air defense with enough force to achieve meaningful damage, a mission Israeli air power can potentially execute, but not without losses and not without triggering Iranian responses that escalate the conflict to a level where American restraint becomes an even more acute problem than it already demonstrated itself to be last night. The reassessment option requires acknowledging publicly that the current strategic posture is not sustainable, that the IDF cannot maintain operational effectiveness across multiple fronts against an adversary with demonstrated drone swarm capability and the strategic patience to sustain a long-term attrition campaign. That acknowledgement leads toward negotiation, and negotiation requires concessions that the current Israeli political coalition has built its entire identity around refusing to make. There is no comfortable path forward from the northern Negev this morning. The Merkava tanks burning in the desert are not just destroyed vehicles. They are the physical remains of a strategic approach built on borrowed power, maintained through dependency, and sustained by the assumption that technological superiority purchased from outside can substitute indefinitely for sovereign military capability built through self-reliance. That assumption ended last night, 47 tanks. 4 hours, a doctrine dismantled, and a strategic assumption permanently retired. Leave your assessment in the comments, share this if it delivered value, subscribe if you are not already. The next analysis picks up exactly where this one leaves off.